Let's take the perceived stress scale. The questions in this scale ask you about your feelings and thoughts during the last month. In each case, you will be asked to indicate how often you felt or thought a certain way. The perceived stress scale was originally developed in 1983. It can help us understand how different situations affect our feelings and perceived stress. On each question, you will be asked your response in the last month. 0 is never, 1 is almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 fairly often, 4 very often. You will see each answer, each question on the screen, as well as have an opportunity to respond. Let's go. Number 1. In the last month, how often have you been upset because of something that happened unexpectedly? 0 never, 1 almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 fairly often, 4 very often. Number 2, in the last month, how often have you felt that you were unable to control the important things in your life? 0 is never, 1 almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 fairly often, 4 very often. Let's pause here for just one moment for me to remind you of some things. Don't overthink this. Write down the first answer that comes to your mind. Thank you. Number 3, in the last month, how often have you felt nervous and stressed? 0 never, 1 almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 fairly often, 4 very often. Question 4. In the past month, how often have you felt confident about your ability to handle your personal problems? 0 never, 1 almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 fairly often, 4 very often. Number 5. In the last month, how often have you felt that things were going your way? 0 never, 1 almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 fairly often, 4 very often. Let's pause again in that I'm reading exactly what you are able to see because we learn different ways, we receive information different ways. So I am reading as well as you can see exactly the questions. Number 6, in the last month, how often have you found that you could not cope with all the things that you had to do? 0 never, 1 almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 fairly often, 4 very often. Number 7, in the last month, how often have you been able to control irritations in your life? 0 never, 1 almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 fairly often, 4 very often. Number 8, in the last month, how often have you felt that you were on top of things? 0 never, 1 almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 fairly often, 4 very often. Number 9, in the last month, how often have you been angered because of things that were outside of your control? 0 never, 1 almost never, 2 sometimes, 3 very often. 4, I did that backward. 3, fairly often. 4, very often. Number 10, in the last month, how often have you felt difficulties were piling up so high that you could not overcome them? 0, never. 1, almost never. 2, sometimes. 3, fairly often. 4, very often. That is the last question. Now we're going to do something called math and computation. I'm going to read this to you and allow you to compute. The PSS scores are obtained by reversing responses for items 4, 5, 7, and 8. So if you answered 0, your number would be 4. If you answered 1, you would write 3. 2 is 2. 3 will equal 1 point. And 4 is 0. If you're like me and don't math, take your time. Now, add up your scores for each item to get a total. I'm still going to pause here because that was math. I don't do math. Let's review your answers. You could pause before we get to this screen as well. So if you need to pause it, go back one. Don't cheat, because some of us will change our answers. If your scores were between 0 and 13, that would be considered low stress. Scores 14 to 26 would be considered moderate stress. And scores 27 to 40 would be high perceived stress. So where do we go from this point? You can stay in place and just exist. You can move through your fears and face them and make some changes. And that's what I'm hoping that we all will do. Or maybe something else. Let me know what you're going to do. Let's go from here. Let's evolve together. Thank you for your time.